overfished.
Well, my theory is that
System.
the only time I've ever been there, you had like a driving range and you could hit golf balls into the prawn
Yeah, gee, that's a long
pools.
time ago. That's a long time ago.
Well, I was just wondering if maybe they'd all been hit by accident.
So is this
no different to any other activity where sometimes you'll catch prawns and they're on the bite or off the bite, and we've had good months, bad months, we've had good years and bad years, but this year in particular, it's still a mystery. It can only be one of two things: either an environmental issue, but we would have seen dead prawns. We haven't found any dead prawns at all in the last 4 weeks. They went off their feed a month ago. And we stopped seeing molts, which is an indication that they've stopped growing. We will always see molts on the side of the ponds where they climb out of their shell. And
so you're still open, but the issue has got so bad that you've closed the prawn fishing part.
Yep. The fishing is one aspect of our park business. People, we're still open for business. We want to make that very clear to the public that we're still very much open for business. We've got all sorts of fun activities out there. We've developed a park over a long period of time that doesn't just revolve around fishing.
Have you thought of getting in touch with the likes of, say,
what about some salmon or something
the Prawn Institute, a scientific body to try and bring back the prawns?
Oh, look, we're in the early stages of working with MPI. We've been overseas trying to sort out all the challenges we've had over the years. We've got great associates with the University of Thailand, and obviously in Thailand, the Thai farmers in Thailand. I've been over there quite a few times. Australia, we have a consultant we work with who came out in February.
Gosh.
And we've been under his instructions and guidance for the last sort of 12 months or
what a mystery.
10 months, whatever it is.
All right,
and prior to that, we had another scientist we've been working with very closely, but he wasn't able to progress things. So we're doing everything. We've reconditioned the bottom of our ponds over the last couple of years. The water quality's never been as good.
Gosh, well, all the very best, Richard. All the very best to you, and may the prawns come back. That's Richard Klein from Hoka Prawn Park in Taupo. Have you been there, Linda?
I have. You know what? I went there years ago.
Yeah.
I thought it was a joke. I was like, what do you mean you go prawn fishing? I think of those prawns as like those little teeny tiny things you get on top of a salad.
Did
you
it
get one
catch
or
any?
two. No, I didn't catch any.
You see, same here. All right, Patrick Smelly, Linda Hallinan, thank you very much for being with me this afternoon.
Okay.
Very, very good. All right, I'm Wallace Chapman, back tomorrow, Friday's show, 3:45. See you then.
Whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere ake nei, taxpayers pick up the $30 million tab for disputed land at Ihumātao. The plan is to still build houses there. An independent report uncovers a litany of shortcomings at a mental health unit where 2 people died by suicide a week apart. So did the DHB know things weren't up to scratch, and what did it do? The boss of Ports of Auckland doubles down on claims COVID is the cause of its woes. Meanwhile, retailers are staring at lean-looking shelves. Cyclone Yasa bears down on Fiji, packing 350k an hour winds with more than 500,000 people in its path. And the cost of buying a batch has doubled in some of our holiday hotspots.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, ko Susana Leātau tēnei. It's been an emotional day at Ihumātao for those who campaigned for years against Fletcher's planned development of the land. The government has bought the whenua for just under $30 million, and an agreement has been signed with the kingitanga to decide its future. Stacey Bishop, a supporter of the Save Our Unique Landscape campaign, says today is not the end of the generations-long fight, but it is a step forward.
When I was a young girl, I said to my grandmother, Nanny, why don't we have our land back up there? And she said to me, because the fight is too big and the price is too high. That's why. So I never came up here to protect myself from that trauma that my tupuna had gone through.
Stacey Bishop. The land at Ihumātao could still end up in the hands of mana whenua, notwithstanding the government's purchase of it. The government and the kingitanga are setting up a committee, or ropu whakahaere, to determine its long-term use, and the Finance Minister Grant Robertson says it is possible the ownership could change again.
If we get to that point, then there will be considerations about funding at that point. But for now, it has been purchased for the purpose of housing. There will be housing on the site, but the Raupu Whakahaere has to do its work to work out what else might be on the site.
The Finance Minister, Grant Robertson. A national curfew has just come into force in Fiji ahead of Cyclone Yasa's expected landfall tonight. The Category 5 storm is beginning to bear down on the two main islands of Viti Levu and Vanuatu, where a state of disaster has been declared. The Prime Minister, Frank Bainimarama, says Yasa could easily surpass the devastation of Cyclone Winston in 2016.
The impact forecast for this latest superstorm is more or less the entire country. Over 850,000 Fijians are in the direct path of the cyclone.
Frank Bainimarama says the government stands ready to respond immediately. More parents and teachers have come forward with claims about children being mistreated at a Fielding childcare centre. The Pitapata Education Centre had its licence suspended for 3 weeks last month, but has since reopened. The Ministry of Education is still investigating what it calls serious complaints and has involved the police. Former teachers have told RNZ the Ministry visited in 2018 to investigate parents' complaints. The sleep room was being used for punishment, but nothing was done. A parent has detailed 14 incidents of her children being badly treated or teachers being bullied. Retailers throughout the country are struggling to get enough stock for Christmas shoppers as the delays at Ports of Auckland continue. As the country enters its busiest retail days of the year, an 8 to 9 day backlog of stock is still at sea or stuck on the wharf. The Port's Chief Executive Tony Gibson largely blames the pandemic for the delays, saying no one foresaw the level of demand.
At the time of COVID, our customers told us that they would be at least 30% down in throughput. That didn't happen, and no one saw the demand cycle coming. So we all misread the situation.
Tony Gibson, and you can hear more from this interview on Checkpoint shortly. A combination of cheap loans and COVID restrictions has sent the price of many holiday homes soaring. Data from the Real Estate Institute shows median sales prices and volumes have risen significantly in some beachside towns. They include Akaroa and Waihi Beach, where prices are up by 50% on this time last year, and more houses have been sold. Institute spokesperson Dee Crooks says low interest rates and the pandemic are factors.
People reassessing their lifestyle options and saying, look, actually, I don't want to live in the city, I don't want to live in an apartment, I'm happy to move that a little bit further out, I can work from home, I've got great broadband, so hey, why not consider a beach location?
Dee Crooks of the Real Estate Institute. It's 4 minutes past 5. Team New Zealand have made a strong statement in the first race of the America's Cup World Series, beating Italy's Luna Rossa by more than 3 minutes. The hosts dominated from start to finish in breezy conditions on the Waitemata Harbour. Team UK's technical issues continued in race 2 with a steering cable problem handing American Magic an easy win. Team New Zealand faced the Americans in today's fourth and final race, which is about to get underway. The men's tennis governing body ATP has announced that the Australian Open will start on February the 8th, 3 weeks later than planned. Tennis Australia and the Victorian and Australian governments are yet to confirm the revised 2021 calendar. Qualifying for the season's first major is being moved to Doha in mid-January, followed by a 2.5-week period set aside for travel to Melbourne and 14 days quarantine. Defending champions Liverpool have beaten Tottenham 2-1 to open up a 3-point lead over the London club at the top of the English football's Premier League. Everton have moved back into the top 5 with a 2-0 win over fourth-placed Leicester, while Arsenal drew 1-1 with Southampton. Leeds beat Newcastle 5-2 and Fulham pulled themselves out of the bottom 3 by drawing 0-0 with Brighton. And play has just got underway in the day-night cricket test between Australia and India in Adelaide. India won the toss and chose to bat first. That's the news.
House prices to keep rising.
Until we can scale up and provide hundreds of homes rather than dozens of homes, we're just not going to get there.
Dismay over abuse in state care.
In our first trial, I actually wanted to crawl through the floor. I just felt so disgusted about the way that our two plaintiffs were cross-examined.
And Fiji battens down on cyclone watch.
And we can see the government is coming in strong to ask the people, stock up on food, look after your families.
On your radar, Morning Report, weekdays from 6, on air and online.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Wellington, including Coromandel Peninsula and Bay of Plenty. Fine apart from areas of morning and evening cloud. Taumaranui, Taupo and Taihape mainly fine. Isolated showers developing tomorrow afternoon. Gisborne to Wairarapa fine at first. Cloud increasing and drizzle developing tonight. Becoming fine again later tomorrow. Nelson and Marlborough mainly fine. Low cloud and patchy drizzle about eastern Marlborough clearing tomorrow morning. Canterbury, low cloud and patchy drizzle about the coast and plains, clearing tomorrow morning. Fine for the high country. Bulla, Westland, Fiordland, Otago and Southland, fine spells, but patchy light rain or drizzle at times. Rain becoming persistent in Fiordland tomorrow. Chatham Islands, mostly cloudy. RNZ National at 7 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna. Kia ora, this is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. Taxpayers are picking up the almost $30 million tab for the disputed land at Ihumātao, with plans to put some kind of housing on the site. The Finance Minister, Grant Robertson, says it was becoming his generation's bastion point and the government had to intervene. Fletcher's says the deal is break-even for it after the company's plans to develop the site were scuppered when protesters moved in to protect the historically significant site. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
Tahirua toruwha, give us back our whenua. That I found unsafe amongst you peacekeepers because you haven't stayed.
It was mid-last year when protesters flocked to Ihumātao to support occupiers who'd been delivered an eviction notice. Today, a resolution.
The government came out to announce that they've purchased the whenua from Fletcher's. Has been a 6-year
Grant Robertson says it was a situation the government wasn't prepared to ignore.
We had a situation that was on its way to being my generation's bastion point, and I was not prepared, and the government was not prepared to stand to the side and allow what could have been a very divisive and destructive period of time to happen.
It was with mixed emotions the face of the occupation, Pania Newton from Seoul, received the news.
I'm both happy but sad at the same time that it took so long, and some of those who started this kaupapa with us have now passed on, and so yeah, it's sad to think about that, but also I'm looking forward to really celebrating this achievement with our whānau.
This deal has been a result of more than a year of negotiations between the government, Fletcher's and, on behalf of mana whenua, Kingitanga. Under the deal, a steering committee or rōpū whakahaere will be established. It has 5 years to figure out what kind of housing might go on the land, how it will be managed and, further into the future, ownership. Mr Robertson says there'd have to be further discussions if the Crown was to hand over ownership to another party.
If there is to be usage beyond housing, there is room within the current agreement for that, but if it changed extensively from that, then we would look again at the funding issues.
A spokesperson for the Kingitanga, Rukumoana Schaffhausen, says the resolution is the first step in the healing process.
This agreement reconnects the whānau, the descendants of the original owners, back to the whenua, where they can start to dream again. In their words, that is their words.
Part of the Memorandum of Understanding signed as all parties agree this does not constitute a settlement of historical treaty claims. A response to concerns any deal could effectively reopen full and final settlements. National says the ramifications of the deal set a dangerous precedent for other land occupations. The Māori Development Minister Willie Jackson insists the Ihumātao deal will not unwind any historical or future settlements under the Treaty of Waitangi.
This isn't going to open a can of worms at all, because the important thing here is this was not part of the treaty settlement process, and we keep emphasising that this was not part of a treaty deal.
Grant Robertson driving the point home.
When Waikato Tainui did their settlement, this was in private ownership within the Wallace family. It was not considered within that. So it is important to see this for what it is. It is a unique settlement outside of the treaty settlement process.
Māori Party co-leader Rawiri Waititi begs to differ, saying this opens up a whole range of opportunities.
This is not an isolated case, that there are many ihumātaos around this country that also need to be addressed. And so the Māori Party will be pushing hard in that space.
ACT is scathing, with party leader David Seymour saying the Prime Minister has empowered radicals who threatened to disturb the peace and then rewarded them with the gift of someone else's property. National's finance spokesperson Michael Woodhouse agrees. Furthermore, he doesn't believe there'll be any housing development at Ihumātao despite the deal agreed to.
The protesters were there because they didn't want housing on Ihumātao. And as soon as the government tries to do the same, I expect the protesters will come back. The reality is not only have we paid $30 million for this, 500 fewer houses are going to be built in the city that needs them the most.
Greens co-leader Marama Davidson says any suggestion this could see settled treaty claims relitigated is rubbish, and says it would be good to see the government take a more innovative approach like it has with Ihumātao in the future.
Ultimately, this is about setting our future country up for harmonious relations and a true commitment to te tiriti.
Pania Newton says they now look forward to engaging in the process of deciding the future of the land under the guidance of Kingitanga. She was asked what kind of housing Sol would like to see on Ihumātao.
Our whānau really haven't had an opportunity to discuss what kind of aspirations they have for the whenua. I'm sure we will get that done in the next stages before us, but I think most of the conversations have been around preserving and conserving this cultural heritage landscape.
The government will breathe a big sigh of relief this is signed and sealed before the end of the year. There's naturally a big emphasis on the Māori-Crown relationship and the big events that kick off the political year, Ratana and Waitangi. The Prime Minister and her ministers would have previously been able to place the blame on New Zealand first, but had no such excuse come 2021. While the deal may not be so warmly welcomed by all constituents, they can start the new year with something in the bag. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Jane Patterson.
A North Shore inpatient mental health unit where 2 people died by suspected suicide within a week of each other was not up to standard, and Waitemata DHB knew it. An independent review into the deaths at He Puna Waiora in 2019 highlights a number of serious concerns, including a strong reliance on managing people with medication rather than therapies, early discharges due to pressure on beds, 6-month wait times for talk therapy in the community, a lack of leadership, burnt-out staff, no effective primary nursing system and unsafe elements in the actual building design, problems that staff knew about prior to the deaths. Whānau interviewed for the report believed their loved ones had experienced neglect, humiliation, stress and a lack of dignity, respect, support and therapy at the hands of the DHB. As well as the 2 inpatient deaths, the report also confirms the deaths of 2 other people by suicide who were also in Waitemata's care. One as an outpatient, the other at a respite facility. Waitemata's DHB's Director of Mental Health Services, Derek Wright, explains what he thinks went wrong, but starts with an apology.
So can I just start by saying that we want to publicly apologise to the families because this has been a tragedy, and clearly there was some deficits in our care. We've written to the families and we've written them a letter of apology. We also just want to acknowledge that we fully accept the recommendations within the review report. So it's our intention to implement all the recommendations in the review report. And this is the DHB accepts it. I mean, our staff come to work every day and do the best they can within sometimes very difficult circumstances.
Deficits is a bit of a euphemism, isn't it? They're shortcomings and failings, aren't they?
Well, yeah, I mean, you can use shortcomings and failings, deficits. For me, it means the same thing. There was issues in terms of the care that were provided to these 2 young men who are not now there with their families for Christmas.
It was more than the 2 young men in care, though, wasn't it? Because there were 2 other deaths by suicide who may not have been in that unit, but they were under the DHB's care, and they too are mentioned in this report.
Yeah, there was 2 suicides within the unit, which were 5 days apart, and there was a suicide of a young man in the community who had been in the unit, I think 2 months previously, and there was a suicide or suspected suicide of a person who was in a respite facility in West Auckland.
So that is, well, those are horrendous outcomes for a service that is supposed to protect and care for some of our most vulnerable.
Yeah, it's certainly two inpatient suicides are a very rare occurrence. So it's very rare to have inpatient suicides in an inpatient unit any place in the world, but especially in New Zealand. And bearing in mind that the unit's been open since 2015, thousands of people have gone through the unit, but sadly we have lost 2 people in that unit in May 2019.
What of the shortcomings outlined in this report was the DHB aware of prior to the deaths? Because there's a long list. So which ones did you know about?
Well, I don't know if the DHB knew about all the shortcomings, because obviously the individual adverse event reviews that were undertaken when the suicides took place identified a number of areas that needed to be reviewed and recommendations were made, and we started to work on them straight away. So things like the model of care, for instance, and the model of care in mental health continues to change, as you would expect. So the people we deal with today are not the type of people we dealt with 20 years ago.
But Derek, if we can be specific here, right? So there were faults in the building. The design of the building is not necessarily suitable for the kind of care that you're giving people. Nurses don't have a direct line of sight for at-risk patients. They are in offices that are tucked away from the people that they are caring from. There were problems with the nursing model, and this report specifies that these faults were known by your staff and they requested, assistance around these areas prior to the deaths. So you did explicitly know about some of the shortcomings, didn't you?
Well, we knew that there'd been changes to the building because the original design, and as the report identifies, it was a part of the building that was changed. So, I mean, one of the issues we have is we don't have a standard design for inpatient units in New Zealand.
But if you knew there were shortcomings, why didn't you do more and do it faster?
Well, I guess the DHB thought that we had put in systems and processes that would actually assist. Clearly they didn't, which is why there's further recommendations and further work that needs to be done.
Staff shortages, inexperienced staff, burnt-out staff, lack of leadership, wait times for therapies. Did you know about those things?
Well, staffing is an issue, obviously, and staffing is an issue throughout New Zealand. I mean, we recruit a lot of people from overseas because we don't grow enough mental health nurses in this country, and that's partly about the way mental health nurses are trained. It's very different to the years ago when I trained as a mental health nurse. So recruiting people into inpatient units is always a challenge, and we've certainly been very successful over the last 12 months in recruiting more and more staff into our inpatient services. So, but I mean, although there was issues in terms of recruitment, the rosters were filled. So, and obviously that was filled by the use of casuals and also by the use of overtime. So we didn't have roster gaps.
But the point is, you knew there were issues around staffing.
And we were working hard on these issues around staffing. You can't just, we can't just create staff out of thin air. We actually, a number of the staff that we recruit come from overseas, and that takes time, as well as obviously our homegrown nurses. So we take the new graduates. We have a number of staff and students who come on placement with us, and obviously we recruit into them. We have a new nurse program that we run, so we bring about 20 nurses into that program every year as well. So we're trying really hard to make sure that we've got enough nurses, enough clinical staff to actually continue to provide services.
And I appreciate that you were trying very hard, but was what you did good enough?
Well, clearly in hindsight, no. I mean, at the end of the day, 2 people lost their lives while under our care. I can't walk away from that, Lisa.
In terms of the care people receive at He Puna Waiora, why is there such a heavy reliance on medicating patients?
Well, what you have to remember is that it's a balance. So the people who come into an acute inpatient unit are often very unwell. So medication is often the first line to actually calm the person, to get to the point where you can actually start to do more of the psychosocial services. A lot of the psychosocial work is actually done in the community. And with the changes in mental health, with Hera Oranga and the move to primary mental health, secondary services will actually do less work than we'll do in primary mental health. And that's where you can do a lot of the psychosocial, so getting people early in their illness, not late in their illness. So
But your own staff indicated to the people who compiled this report that they felt there was an over-reliance on medicating patients. I'm wondering, was that basically a form, effectively chemical restraint, isn't it?
No, it's not, and I think we've got good evidence to show that. We've got the lowest seclusion rate in the country, and there's been a programme that's been run by the Health Quality and Safety Commission for the last 5 years. And what that's shown is that our staff actually work actively with the clients to make sure that we can deal with situations where a restraint or an incident may occur, and that's not happening. And there's no evidence that to do that they're using more medication. So
that reliance, sorry to interrupt, but was that reliance in any way because you don't have the therapists available to work with people in these inpatient settings, or as many of them as you need?
Well, we'd always like to have more therapists. We've actually increased the number of psychologists. We've also increased allied health assistants at the weekend so that we can run extra programs at the weekends, because obviously when you're in an inpatient unit, one of the issues is actually making sure that there's enough activities to keep you stimulated as well. And in some situations that probably wasn't happening as well as it could have, because not that the positions weren't there, but some of the positions weren't filled.
Which brings me back to my original question, Derek. Is the heavy reliance on medicating patients because you did not have those other resources, access to talk therapists and other specialists, and staff available to assist with activities that would stimulate the people in that environment and help them recover?
It's a balance. I mean, medication is always going to be
Did you have the balance wrong?
Well, we may well have had the balance wrong in hindsight, but at the time we actually believed that the balance was about right. And obviously...
But how can you say that when your staff have told investigators that they feel there was an over-reliance? They are indicating, the people at the coalface are indicating that you had the balance wrong, aren't they?
Yeah, and I accept that that's the view that's come back from our staff, and that's why we're trying to change the balance to ensure, and we've already put in more programmes, and we've put in more psychologists, and we're actually just out to recruit another 2 psychologists for the units as well. So we're trying to, and again, it's not that easy to recruit psychologists because obviously a psychologist gets paid a hell of a lot more if you go and work in corrections than you do in a DHB.
The 2 people who died by suicide, who were not in He Puna Waiora, but were under the DHB's care at the time of their deaths, did they have a safety plan in place?
Yes, they would have. They would have had a crisis plan and a recovery plan in place.
Are you sure about that?
Well, clearly they didn't work because we've got 2 people who took their own life. Well, we suspected took their own life. Only the coroner can actually rule, but that's certainly what it looks like. But there was plans in place. Were they followed? I can't say.
And you are sure that at the time of their release, a plan was in place at that point in time, not later?
Well, one of them had been in the community for about a month and was being regularly followed up. So they would have had a plan in place, and they were being regularly seen by their community worker, their community nurse. The other person was in a respite facility.
So did they have access, the person who was in the community, access to talk therapy, or were they on waiting lists?
The person in the community, as far as I'm aware, if we're talking about the same person, they were using a private psychologist.
Right, so they couldn't get access to publicly funded services?
Well, you don't need to double up. If you've already got a therapist, then it doesn't make sense to then change if you're happy with the therapist that you've got.
And that was Waitemata DHB's Director of Mental Health Services, Derek Wright. It is 25 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Keen for your feedback. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Interested in your thoughts on mental health services and also what you make of the purchase of that disputed land at Ehumatau for almost $30 million it is. The Fiji government has declared a state of disaster ahead of the arrival of Cyclone Yasa. The cyclone is due to make landfall on Fiji's two main islands this evening, with winds gusting as high as 350 kilometres an hour. A nationwide curfew is now in effect and will last through the night. Thousands of residents in the north of Fiji are beginning to feel the effects of Yasa, as Christine Ravoy reports.
According to the National Disaster Management Office, at least 600,000 people lie in the path of the storm, which is packing winds gusting up to 350 kilometres an hour. The NDMO director, Vasiti Soko, says time for people to evacuate is fast running out.
For those living in coastal areas, please move upland. We are expecting storm surges with waves up to 16 metres. If you need assistance, please contact the Fiji Police Force or your Divisional Commissioner's Emergency Operations Centre to help you move. Please evacuate now. Move your family to higher ground.
In 2016, Winston, a similar magnitude storm, left 44 people dead, tens of thousands homeless, and millions of dollars in damage. Nambowalu in the northern province of Bua lies west and is directly in the path of Cyclone Yasa. During Winston, Bua suffered widespread devastation, including 12 people died. The villagers have been preparing this week since they were alerted to the threat of Yasa. Village headman Paula Dama says during Winston people did not heed the warnings from authorities. But he says this time around they have learnt their lesson and are not taking things lightly.
The strong wind is coming and heavy rain.
The strong winds and heavy rain are coming, but we are in the evacuation centre. Like Winston in 2016, some of our villages were not prepared, but now we are prepared.
Yesterday that we have all been prepared.
Lambasa is the main commercial centre on Vanuatu, and resident Serafina Silaitonga says there's been a hive of activity this morning as the town closes and braces for Yasa.
And people are not wasting time. Because of what happened with Winston, they are moving things, they are putting up shutters and identifying ECs, and already the youths know what to do. They know when to take the elders. Winston really affected them.
To the west of Vanuatu lies Rotuma, and the islanders have been hit with strong winds and heavy rain since last night. 50-year-old Makareta Suso of Oinafa district says the wharf has been damaged.
We can feel that Yasa is here, and even though we are not directly in its path, we can see that with the wharf damaged, this cyclone is not to be taken lightly. People have moved to the village hall for the duration of the storm, which we do not know how long it will be around.
Meanwhile, yacht owners have moved into hotels as they take shelter from the expected wrath of the storm. The main island of Vitilevu is already experiencing power outages, but the government says efforts are being made to restore supply to affected areas. The government also confirmed a nationwide curfew is in place from 4 p.m. to 6 a.m. local time. For Checkpoint, Nayadangu or Christine Ravoy.
After spats between syndicates and all the usual scandals, America's Cup races are finally underway. From today until Saturday, Team New Zealand, American Magic, Team UK and Luna Rossa are contesting the America's Cup World Series in Auckland's Hauraki Golf. An additional Christmas race will be held on Sunday afternoon. Both events are precursors to the America's Cup itself, which is happening early next year. Our reporter Nick Trubridge is down at Auckland's Viaduct. Good evening, Nick. Taxpayers, well, they've forked out hundreds of millions of dollars preparing for this event, so have the crowds come to the party?
Yeah, Lisa. Well, I mean, if you're judging by a number of people down here as someone walked straight through, you would say that the crowds have come to the party. It might not look like much behind me, but if we just pan round, you can see there's sort of a bit of a champagne tent, and pan round again. And this is where the action is at the moment. It's a real grudge match. It's Dean Barker, of course, the ex-Team New Zealand team member, up against Peter Burling. And then behind my shoulder again, there's the Team New Zealand base, which is, of course, where the boys, after this race, will come back in and prepare for the next 3 days racing.
I'm assuming for those people listening that all those people with their backs turned to you, Nick, are gazing up at some kind of big screen there, are they?
Sorry, I can't say that again, Lisa. I can't hear you, but if you're talking about the racing, we've had 3 races already. The first race, of course, Team New Zealand was all over Luna Rossa, really. It was a bit of a mauling. They won by about 3 minutes. The second race, I'll just check my notes because I want to make sure I get it right. America beat Team UK. Team UK had a bit of a gear issue there. The third race, Team UK, another gear issue, a bit of a lame duck, you could say. They completely stopped. They were almost afraid that they were going to go into the vessels watching the race, rather. And so, safe to say, Luna Rossa took that one. And as I say, Team New Zealand hoping to make it double delight before they come in and prepare for the next 3 days. There's 2 more days of this America's Cup World Series, Lisa. There's then a Christmas race on Sunday ahead of the real racing next year.
Thanks, Nick. That's Nick Trowbridge, who's been down at Auckland's Viaduct Harbour there, and, an eventful day on the water, it seems. Eventful day all round, it would seem. Well, coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, the boss of the Ports of Auckland blames COVID for freighting gnarl-ups, along with poor forecasting. The government promises coronavirus vaccines for everyone, but you will have to wait. And a slice of paradise just doubled in price. We would love your feedback about anything you hear on the program this evening. You can text us 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Time for the headlines now with Susanna.
Campaigners against Fletcher's planned development of land at Ihumātao say today's announcement is a step towards resolving the generations-long fight. The government has bought the whenua for just under $30 million and signed an agreement with the Kingitanga to decide its future. The Finance Minister says notwithstanding the government's purchase, the land could still end up in the hands of mana whenua. A national overnight curfew is now in place in Fiji ahead of the expected landfall of Cyclone Yasa. A state of disaster has been declared as the Category 5 storm bears down on the 2 main islands of Viti-Levu and Vanuatu-Levu. Prime Minister Frank Bainimarama says Yasa could cause worse devastation than Cyclone Winston in 2016. More parents and teachers have come forward claiming children have been mistreated at a Fielding childcare centre. The Pita Pata Centre has reopened 3 weeks after the Education Ministry suspended its licence over what it calls serious complaints involving the police. Former teachers say the ministry investigated parents' complaints that the sleep room was being used for punishment back in 2018, but nothing was done. The Ports of Auckland Chief Executive insists COVID-19 is most to blame for the long delays in offloading cargo. Retailers are frustrated by the backlog of stock during what should be their busiest time of year. The port has had problems rolling out its automation system and says it is short-staffed, but Tony Gibson says the pandemic is the reason for the delays. Air 2 Union is commending Air New Zealand's decision to rehire all its furloughed A320 cabin crew. It follows the government's agreement in principle to establish quarantine-free travel with Australia and Rarotonga early next year. About 170 crew have been on leave without pay since June. Waihi Beach Community Board Chair Rose Gowdy says well-off Aucklanders are outbidding everyone else. Prices are up 50% on a year ago, making rents in the town unaffordable for the locals who work there. Those are the latest news headlines from RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. Kia ora anō. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. Let's get to the business news now with Nicholas Poynton. Nicholas, you've got some new data on small businesses and apparently it shows we're in a K-shaped recovery. What does that all mean?
Yeah, it's probably a good place to start. I'm sure most people are familiar with the term of a V-shaped recovery. That's when, I think the good example to think of is the lockdowns. When we went into lockdown, activity rocketed down and then as we came out, it shot back up. So if you looked at that activity on a graph, it would look like a V. But I think probably, the way a V-shaped recovery takes us all as the same. We all went down and we'll all come up. But on the fringes, there's talk about a K-shaped recovery. And it maybe suggests that not everyone went back up when we came out of lockdown. There are still some industries, like the strands of a K, that are going down while others are going up. So that's where all this letter business is coming from. And this may be a way to think about what's going on with small businesses at the moment, because we've got this new data from the accounting firm Xero, and it shows that revenues for small businesses are up 3.2% on last year. Employment in SMEs, they are up higher than before the pandemic struck, but it's likely being dragged up by the strong performance in the manufacturing sector because it's not rosy for everyone, and this is where we start to see this divergence because hospitality firms at the moment are really, really struggling. According to the Starter, revenue is down 8% on a year ago. Jobs are down 8.5% on pre-pandemic levels. And Xero's managing director here in New Zealand says managers or owners of hospitality businesses in the sector, they're working more than they've ever worked before. There's also that added pressure of not being able to have transient staff or people coming from overseas who work for a couple months at a time. So this is where we start to begin to see this sort of K-shaped divergence begin to emerge. It's probably an effective way or an effective template to start to think about what's going on in certain sectors of the economy. And sadly for hospitality, there's no real strong sign that things are likely to improve this summer because with locked borders, we don't have those international tourists coming who are going to be putting their money into our cafes and restaurants and the like.
Okay, you want to talk about the Nissan Leaf. We discussed it briefly yesterday.
And I know you turn your nose up at the Nissan Leaf.
I was just questioning the aesthetics of it.
Yeah, the aesthetic value.
Yeah, worthy as an e-vehicle, but yeah.
Well, look, I want to talk about them today because I'm really interested in their batteries. Now, this is one of the things that's probably less talked about with electric vehicles, and this is the big issues with their batteries because electric vehicles, the batteries, they actually have a relatively short lifespan. I was recently notified that when a battery gets less than 80% of its original health, the manufacturer has to replace it. And that's usually about 5 years, and that can vary depending on how the person drives or how they charge the vehicle. But just because the battery isn't being used anymore doesn't mean it doesn't have any function. It can still be used. And this is where this New Zealand company comes into the equation. Counties Power, they're a lines company just outside of Auckland. They sort of cover the area between between the Waikato and Auckland and each coast. And they've entered into a partnership with an Australian battery company as part of this pilot to try and repurpose 9 batteries from Nissan Leafs, the electric vehicle batteries. And what they're trying to do is turn them into power banks that could be used as a backup power supply if there was ever a power cut in that area. So you can imagine a situation, small isolated community, huge power cut. Well, Counties Power says these repurposed batteries, you sort of glue them all together, you make this one big unit. They could power between 15 and 20 houses for about 2 hours. And get this, they say that these units, they could be reused up to 3,000 times, and it could extend the life of these batteries by 9 to 10 years. The question then is, what happens to the batteries then?
Yeah.
And I'm really interested in this stuff. I find it really exciting.
Because it gives it a second life and a long second life, as opposed to finding somewhere in the tip for it.
Exactly, and that's probably the concern that we'll have to wait and see because we're hearing more and more talk about electric vehicles, but maybe less consideration for some of the issues that come with these cars and also some of the challenges about really how sustainable are they? You've got to think about most of the batteries now in these cars are lithium ion. That's a lot of raw materials you've got to go mine to make those batteries, and they cannot be easily recycled. So it's these other purposes, these second life purposes that people, or hope maybe the private sector will start to think about to try and give them a second life and really extend their use.
Okay, well, what's been going on the markets today?
So the NZX is up 60 points to 12,889. Our dollar, on the back of those strong GDP numbers, is up to 71 US cents, 94 Australian and 52.6 British pence.
Thanks, Nicholas. Nicholas Poynton with Business News. The boss of Ports of Auckland is insisting delays in offloading cargo and its switch to automation are the fault of COVID. Retailers are frustrated at the backlog of stock still at sea or stuck on the wharf as shelves run thin. Port workers have told Checkpoint they have ongoing concerns about safety at the port following 2 deaths there. Auckland Mayor Phil Goff simply can't express confidence in the CEO, whose salary is understood to be more than $800,000 a year. And Mr Goff is waiting to see if things improve. Even the Port's CEO, Tony Gibson, says he's not happy with its performance. So I asked him why he thinks he should keep his job.
I think that we have to go back to the impact what COVID has had on the organisation. I mean, we've had to keep our our workforce is separate. That's had an impact on productivity. And despite the fact that we're not as productive as we have been, we have got a motivated workforce to make sure we get things done, we get goods cleared, and once the ships are here, we're getting good throughput through the terminal. The dwell time of the container is around 1.8 days, which by international standards is first class. And delivery on the truck grid, both auto and manual, is around the same.
So it's all COVID's fault?
COVID has played a big part.
Because Tauranga Port is going gangbusters, and it would have been facing the same kind of COVID challenges as you. So how do you reconcile that?
Well, it doesn't have the same COVID factors as we do because we are the largest import port in New Zealand, and of course there has been a rush of import cargoes. Now, at the time of COVID, our customers told us that they would be at least 30% down in throughput. That didn't happen. And no one saw the demand cycle coming. So we all misread the situation. And look, we've also got a situation where 8 months ago, Treasury was predicting unemployment of 13.5%. And along that basis, our customers were telling us, well, you'll see a drop of 30% in imports. We were expecting a terrible year.
So you haven't answered my original question. Why should you keep your job? The Mayor of Auckland is unable to express confidence in you. We've had correspondence from people who feel that you're not up to the job. So why should you keep your job?
Well, it's interesting. I read the headline of that story, and it's classic clickbait media theatre. When you listen to what the Mayor said, it's fair enough. He wants to see the result of automation. In any case, I talked to the Mayor directly and we meet regularly, and I met him the day after your interview. It was a good meeting. I'm clear on his expectations, and that's how it should be.
He was very clear. He cannot at this time express confidence in you. He is remaining quiet until he sees automation complete, as you say, but he can't express confidence in you right now.
The Mayor has expectations, and I'm very, very clear about those.
And you're not meeting his expectations at the moment, are you?
Well, those expectations that I've just explained to you have been as a result of COVID.
Right, so we're back to the same point that you're saying that this is all due to COVID. But looking at the port's annual results, in terms of share of the container market, crane rates, rolling container totals, it looks like you've been trending down in some cases from as far back as 2014. So that indicates it's not all COVID, doesn't it?
A market share and COVID are two separate things, and I accept that our market share has been declining somewhat. In fact, that's our overall market share, but our import market share has been increasing, and there is a reason for that. We've had so many what I would call port studies on the Ports of Auckland, and I wouldn't like to think how many millions have been spent, but we had a port future study which put in question the geographical location of Ports of Auckland. And at that time, we also gave away the ability to reclaim land. So that's how and why we had to automate, so that we could increase our capacity from 1 million to 1.5 to 1.8 million. And the very reason that we've lost market share is that we haven't had the capacity.
All of this obviously is of little consolation to people whose livelihoods are being jeopardised because of delays and inefficiencies getting their freight, which is coming through your port. What reassurances can you give them that you're going to deliver by Christmas when they need this?
Well, we still have delays. We have one ship outside today, and that's been delayed 4 days. But on average, we're about 8 to 9 days at the moment. But we're
so people aren't going to get their goods by Christmas then?
Possibly not. But I think you've also got differentiators with certain importers, and some are working on the just-in-time principle. Others actually have buffer in their stock, and they're okay. But it's obviously the ones that haven't got buffer and need their goods. But we're working hard to actually employ more people.
Okay, well, let's talk about workers then. How short are you?
Well, so far we've hired 23 more people so far, and we need a few more crane drivers. In fact, we need 12 crane drivers, and we need about 10 more straddle drivers. So we're well on the way.
Okay.
But what's interesting is that we're dealing with a very, very tight labour market, and what we're finding is that despite the fact we've got 23 FTEs through the door, we're only having a 25% success rate. And we're not lowering our standard in terms of the people we employ.
Right, this is really interesting because we've heard from a straddle crane driver who's had more than a decade of experience at your port.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that person applied for one of the jobs and got an email back, which we've seen, that says they don't have enough experience. I'm wondering, what kind of worker are you after? Are you after a cheaper worker?
No, most certainly not after a cheaper worker. I mean, straddle drivers and crane drivers are paid very well. But you know, we have a certain standard and skill set. So there's two things we're doing. We're employing from outside based on the skill set criteria, but we're also retraining people who have got the critical skill factors.
How many of those workers did you rationalise or trim back as you headed into automation?
We didn't.
None, you're saying? Because that's not what your workers tell us.
No. Well, you know, we have the same staff numbers as we have a year ago, about 272.
The same configuration, the same number of straddle drivers and crane drivers?
Yes.
So you're saying nobody lost their job as a result of automation?
No one has lost their job as a result of automation. And the workforce has been told very, very clearly that we will only consider redundancies after automation is fully embedded. And the other thing that we've told them is we would much rather build up the volume and keep the staff. And that's been communicated widely in the organisation.
Okay. How well is automation working?
We're very happy with automation, but as you...
How can you be happy with it when you're not meeting targets and you had an incident with one of your automated cranes recently?
Well, we are meeting targets. In fact, the first week of automation, we achieved crane rates, which was by far world standard. The only issue that we've got is that we should have had full terminal rollout by now, but we had to put that on hold because of COVID, because we couldn't get the software engineers and people from Kona Cranes out here, and we couldn't train people. So we had to put automation on hold, and that's the reason why we are delayed, and that's why we don't have the capacity. But if you talk about how we're going with automation, we're very happy with the way it's performing. But it's a complex system. It's complex software. And, you know, every time you have an upgrade, there might be issues. But we have issues with terminal management systems, which also control the manual strads.
Okay, well, that's interesting again, because what you're saying conflicts with what we are hearing from your staff. On Monday, we understand that you had 3 auto cranes that were operating that were shut down because they were becoming overloaded and had on average slow or low shifting rates, 4 to 6 boxes an hour. And then you went over to manual drivers because they could shift more. Is that what was happening?
That's not correct.
So what is the truth
we had
of the
a 3-hour delay with the cranes on Monday, and it had nothing to do with automation. It was to do with a system called XPS, which is related to our main terminal operating system. So it had nothing to do with automation.
But that meant that your automation wasn't able to be at full capacity? Is that what you're saying?
Oh, the automated straddles still delivered to the road grid and in record speed.
But not at the full operating capacity that you would be at if you hadn't had that glitch.
Lisa, it had nothing to do with automation.
So did you swap over to using manual drivers on Monday because of issues?
No, you can't do that.
So there were no problems with automation on Monday, is that what you're saying?
The northern terminal stopped for 3 hours because we had an issue with XPS, which is linked to our terminal operating system. It has nothing to do with the software called Teams that drives automation.
So what, was the system overloaded?
No, it wasn't overloaded. It was a software glitch, which happens periodically. In every port around, funny enough, in every port around the world, it happens.
Okay, so you did have issues.
Yeah, but it was nothing to do with automation.
You've had safety issues there, serious safety issues. You've had 2 people die on your watch.
Yes.
Who are those 2 people?
Well, I know the 2 people, but I'm not going to name them on the program. But and we recognise that we do have.
Do you know their names, Tony?
Yes, I do know their names.
Okay, so they're in the public domain. Who are they?
Yeah, Palamo Kalati and Laboon, Dyer Laboon.
Laboon Dyer, yeah.
Yeah.
So are workers safe there at the port?
I believe workers are safe. We recently undertook a survey, and it would appear that we do have, however, some what I would call safety culture issues, which we're addressing at the moment.
Safety culture issues? So that sounds like areas where you're not safe?
Well, what it boils down to is that there are some people that are not speaking up, and we encourage people to speak up when they consider that something or someone is working unsafely. And we've been doing a lot of work in the last months to retrain, recalibrate, and make sure that all our people are not fearful of coming forward and saying what they want. We want them to feel safe. They have to feel safe.
So why don't they feel safe to speak up? Isn't that an issue with your culture and environment?
Yes, and I recognise that there has been an issue around our safety culture, which we are addressing.
So why are they unable to speak up?
Well, they could be cultural issues, but I can assure you in the last months, and again through the staff engagement survey, we've had significant follow-up to make sure people are not afraid to speak up and talk out about wanting to feel safe and what are the issues.
What do you mean by cultural issues?
Well, cultural issues, we have a large Pacific Island Maori community, and very often they are what I would call shy in coming forward to address issues. We've spoken to them, and we want to ensure that through their leaders that they are and have an avenue to come through and express how they feel about safety.
Are they scared that they're going to lose their jobs if they do that?
No way. No, we want a no-blame culture.
Understand that, but is part of their fear that they will lose their jobs?
Absolutely not.
Have you asked them that?
Yes.
So I understand you recently did a staff survey. What did that tell you?
Well, what it said, the first thing is that people enjoy very much working at the Ports of Auckland, so I think that's a really good thing. And despite the fact that we have had what I would call a hell of a year, our people have been heroic. They've stood up, and despite the fact we've got some operational issues, they are delivering and they're working hard, despite what I would call an area where there is some fear. COVID did create fear, but our people worked all the way through COVID to make sure that essential and non-essential items were delivered. And that you've got to be proud of.
What responsibility do you take for the deaths at the port and the current problems with freighting delays?
Well, I have to take responsibility for the deaths, and I have to take responsibility for the freighting delays. But, COVID didn't start at the Ports of Auckland.
And how does that responsibility manifest itself?
Well, we're doing everything possible to make sure that we can operate in a far more efficient manner.
I'm asking about you because you've said that you have to take responsibility, and you do. So yes. How are you taking responsibility?
I'm working very hard to make sure that we can get the operation back to normal, along with my team.
So, how do you rank the port's performance right now?
I'm not happy with the port's performance.
How do you rank the port's performance?
Well, look, Lisa, for 4 years in a row, we've won Best Port in Oceania. So, we're talking about one glitch here, and yet we've had and have been the highest productive port in Oceania. Now, that doesn't come at, and that's voted for by our customers. So that says something. And this glitch, as I've already explained to you, we put fairly and squarely at the feet of COVID. And if customers tell you at COVID time that you're going to have a reduction in volumes of 30%, what do you think you do?
Do you really think it is one glitch? You've had 2 deaths in recent times. You've acknowledged that you're unable to get the staff that you need. People are fearful about reporting concerns in the working environment, and some people don't feel safe there. Surely these things are all connected and they are not just a single glitch.
You were referring to our operational performance, and I said that our operational performance has been impacted by COVID, fairly and squarely. We underestimated, as did many, many people, many organisations, the demand curve, and we're doing something about making sure we can meet that demand curve going forward. But you can't solve it overnight.
And that's Auckland Ports CEO Tony Gibson. Meanwhile, retailers across the country are still struggling to get enough stock for their Christmas shoppers as the delays at the Ports of Auckland continue. There's a backlog of stock still at sea or stuck on the wharf, and it couldn't be worse timing as the country enters its busiest retail week of the year. Kate Gregan reports.
The The problem is widespread, with retailers from all over New Zealand feeling the effects from the delays at the Ports of Auckland. Rob Cameron is the co-founder of In Vivo Wines. He says 7 containers of their Rosé Prosecco is sitting on a ship and won't be on its way to customers anytime soon.
Well, I mean, essentially we're losing out on a substantial amount of our Christmas sales, and, logistically it puts our supply chain under huge pressure with out of stocks, and that's a, really challenging situation to be in for anybody selling goods.
With the goods not coming to them, he and his co-founder tried to track them down, boarding a small dinghy with a placard reading, "Where's our wine?"
We just wanted to have a bit of fun to say, where's our wine, to find the container ship, and a bit of a hope that it might be there, and as it turns out it was.
Their aim, to highlight there's now an average delay of 8 to 9 days at the ports. Greg Harford's the Chief Executive of Retail New Zealand. He says there are significant stock shortages throughout the retail sector.
Retailers are getting very frustrated by the delays and the lack of really solid information about what's causing these issues. We know that there's less freight coming into New Zealand. We know it's taking a long time to get things off the ships at the ports, and that's really terrible timing given that we're so close to Christmas.
Briscoe's and Rebel Sport are 2 of those retailers facing shortages. Briscoe's Group Managing Director and Deputy Chairman Rodney Duke says the problem's been going on for months, and while the situation isn't critical, it is inconvenient.
Yeah, look, it's never a good time to be running a little short in some product in the run up to Christmas, our busiest time, but we've still got stock, but we're just out of some colours or some sizes.
Julie owns and manages Health Essence Sylvia Park. She too has been hit by delays and hopes the logjam gets sorted sooner rather than later.
We have noticed it a little bit. There are some products that people have asked for, which is their favourite products, and they might not be in stock, so that's disappointing. But it has caused some problems, definitely, and certainly some delays.
The clogged ports are also impacting exports. In Vivo Wines co-founder Rob Cameron says they'll be feeling the effects long after Christmas.
This disruption is holding up goods going out. So, we have 14 containers that we're trying to export from Nelson, and we can't get the empty containers because the goods aren't flowing through from Auckland. So we're missing out on Christmas sales, but then for our goods going to the UK, we're missing out on Easter sales and, further promotional periods.
And the logjam could continue for months. Mō te hōtaka o te ahiahine, ko Kate Gregan tēnei.
It is 2 minutes away from 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. I just want to refer to an interview we did earlier this evening with Waitemata District Health Board's Derek Wright, Head of Mental Health Services. He stated during that interview a family whose loved one died as a result of suicide after being in the care of He Puna Waiora was being seen by a private psychologist at the time of his death. That was not correct. And Waitemata DHB would like to correct the record. In fact, the individual was on a waiting list trying to get access to a publicly funded psychologist. They were not in the care of a private psychologist after their release from He Puna Waiora. This is off the back of a report that outlines a litany of shortcomings with the services at He Puna Waiora, where 2 young men died in 2019 as the result of suspected suicide. Now, a lot of you have been getting in touch about that. One listener says, I have had family members in inpatient mental health. All the system does is put more and more pills down the unwell person's throats. Weekends are the worst. The nurses just drug them more and more as they are too scared to disturb the specialists at the weekend. And someone else says, I have been asking for suicide therapy for 4 years. I am also denied is not suicidal enough because I own pets, no matter how hard I beg for help, that listener says. Mike has got in touch to say not enough psychotherapists in the WDHB, that is the Waitemata District Health Board. Do keep your feedback coming on that issue. Text us on 2101.
RNZ News at 6, ngā mihi nui ko Susana Leātau at tēnei. The Māori Development Minister Willie Jackson is adamant the Ihu Mātau land deal will not unwind any historical or future settlements under the Treaty of Waitangi. The government has bought the land from Fletchers for just under $30 million and signed a binding agreement with the Kingitanga to decide its future use. The National Party says the move calls all treaty settlements into question, but Mr Jackson says that's not the case.
This isn't going to open a can of worms at all, because the important thing here is this was not part of the treaty settlement process, and we keep emphasising that this was not part of a treaty deal.
Willie Jackson. The Māori Party says it's excited about what the purchase could mean for other land disputes around the country. Co-leader Rawiri Waititi says the government has been brave and this opens up the prospect of treaty settlement reform.
This is not an isolated case, that there are many ihu mātaus around this country that also need to be addressed, and so the Māori Party will be pushing hard in that space.
Rawiri Waititi says no treaty settlement should be full and final, especially when dispossessed people are getting only 1% of what they're owed. A North Shore mental health unit where 2 people died from suspected suicide within a week of each other last year failed to provide basic standards of care. In a report just released, an independent review has found staff at He Puna Waiora were inexperienced and burnt out, while clinical leadership was ineffective. Family of inpatients interviewed for the report say the Waitemata DHB neglected and humiliated their loved ones. The board's Director of Mental Health, Derek Wright, says it fully accepts the recommendations for change. A vaccinologist is optimistic past immunisation mistakes can be avoided with COVID vaccines. The government has arranged to buy 4 different vaccines and has outlined plans for offering vaccination to all New Zealanders. Helen Patoutsas-Harris has criticised past programs, especially the inadequate effort during last year's measles outbreak, but she says things are looking up.
We've got a very different approach to this. You know, there's a lot of people involved in this and the logistics are phenomenal. They're being worked through, they're being worked up. So I think it's going to be very different.
Vaccinologist Helen Patoutsas-Harris. A fresh coronavirus outbreak has sent a wave of concern through Sydney. The New South Wales government has issued a public health alert for people living in the city's northern beach suburbs. The ABC's Michael Forno has more.
A woman in her 60s and a man in his 70s have become the latest Sydney-siders to test positive for the virus. New South Wales Health says the pair are close contacts to one another, and at this stage they've not been linked to any other known cases. A number of cafes, restaurants and shops in Palm Beach and Avalon have been identified as potential sites of transmission. Meanwhile, a man who shuttles flight crews to and from Sydney Airport has also tested positive for the virus.
Michael Forno in Sydney. Firefighters have contained a fire that had spread across 80 hectares of Tussock inland from Dunedin since yesterday afternoon. Fire and Emergency says the Department of Conservation will take over monitoring the scene in the hills between Waipouri Falls and Berwick. The Chief Executive of Fish and Game, Martin Taylor, has resigned. The move was announced by the organisation's chairperson, Ray Grubb, during an interview with RNZ on Another Story. Asked if he had confidence in the Chief Executive, Mr Grubb said he had no comment, but then went on to say Mr Taylor had resigned in the last few days. In a text message, Mr Taylor says he has moved on to new challenges and wishes the organisation well. Earlier this year, Fish and Game's National Council reportedly asked him to refrain from making negative comments about farmers. It's 4 minutes past 6. Team New Zealand have had a win and a loss on the opening day of racing in the America's Cup World Series Regatta. They beat Luna Rossa by more than 3 minutes in race 1, but were made to work harder against American Magic, eventually losing by 12 seconds. Team UK continue to struggle with mechanical issues and failed to finish their races against the Italian and American entries. Boxers Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury may consider dropping their world title belts to ensure their potential fight happens. The All-British Showdown would be the first fight in history in which all 4 heavyweight titles were on the line. Each organisation has a pecking order for who challenges next, and each gets a cut of the fight profits. Joshua's promoter, Eddie Hearn, says they won't be held to ransom or let politics get involved in a fight that boxing needs. Russia's appeal against a 4-year ban for all major sporting events will be announced tomorrow. The World Anti-Doping Agency reinstated Russia in 2018 after a 3-year ban for a doping scandal. But last December, it declared Russia's anti-doping agency non-compliant with its code. And Australia have made a perfect start in the first cricket test of the 4-match series against India. Losing the toss and bowling first in Adelaide, they took a wicket with just the second ball when Prithvi Shaw was bowled by Mitchell Starc. Moments ago, India were 25 for 1. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Brad Warrington, a.k.a. DJ Sticky Fingers, continues the story of Kiwi hip-hop's Purple Patch, The Naughties, in which the hungry caterpillar re-emerged as a beautiful break-dancing butterfly. Epi Fight's the word on this week's edition of Our Changing World. William Yang's on the line from Taiwan, and our toxicologist Leo Shep has the poison for the season, alcohol, still the deadliest drug of them all. On Nights with me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service for midnight tomorrow. Northland to Wellington, including Coromandel Peninsula and Bay of Plenty. Fine apart from areas of morning and evening cloud. Taumaranui, Taupo and Taihape mainly fine. Isolated showers developing tomorrow afternoon. Gisborne to Wairarapa fine at first. Cloud increasing and drizzle developing tonight. Becoming fine again later tomorrow. Nelson and Marlborough mainly fine. Low cloud and patchy drizzle about eastern Marlborough clearing tomorrow morning. Canterbury, low cloud and patchy drizzle about the coast and plains, clearing tomorrow morning, fine for the high country. Bulla, Westland, Fiordland, Otago and Southland, fine spells, patchy light rain or drizzle at times, rain becoming persistent in Fiordland tomorrow. And Chatham Islands, mostly cloudy. RNZ National, it's coming up to 7 minutes past 6.
Thanks, Susanna. If you're just joining us, this is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. More parents and teachers have come forward about their experiences at a Fielding childcare centre, which is under investigation. This morning, RNZ revealed more than 17 people had told the Ministry of Education the owner and manager of Pitapata Education Centre would lock toddlers in rooms as punishment and smack them. The Pitapata Education Centre had its licence suspended for 3 weeks in November, but has since reopened. The Ministry is still investigating and says it has passed the complaints on to the police. Charlotte Cook reports.
Allegations of abuse, rough handling children, bullying staff and underfeeding kids has been exposed at Fielding's Pitapata Education Centre. RNZ today revealed almost 20 complaints have been made about the early childcare centre, which resulted in a 3-week licence suspension and a Ministry of Education investigation. They focus on the manager and owner, Pauline Murphy, and her behaviour and treatment towards children, staff and parents. The investigation was launched after 4 Pitapata teachers resigned in a month. One told RNZ she could no longer take it, seeing the way Pauline Murphy was treating children and staff for years. For others, they say their mental health suffered, and more than 20 teachers left in a 2-year period.
I was emotionally drained and my mental state at an all-time low and experiencing severe anxiety caused from stress. I witnessed 80% of the teachers be emotionally abused to the point where they were in tears while still teaching on the floor.
I noticed she would like to attack and insult teachers about their weight and appearance regularly, and she would do this about parents of the centre. I was witness to Pauline telling teachers they were stupid, yelling at them, "What is wrong with you?" and "If you don't like it, leave." She would also like to intimidate us with her lawyers and saying she had connections in the ministry and Teachers' Council and could take our jobs and certificates at any time.
The staff had tried to raise the alarm about the centre, but say they were never listened to. The former teachers confirmed the ministry had visited the centre in 2018 to investigate parents' complaints the sleep room was being used as punishment.
It is ridiculous and really disheartening that Pauline has been able to continue her business for many years with so many complaints and investigations being made against her centre to the Ministry of Education. And yet she's warned by the Ministry of Education visiting, allowing her to prepare and practice fraudulent behaviour to cover up complaints. I've only discussed a few concerning issues. there are many more incidents.
Everyone is probably going to say, why didn't you just speak up? Or why didn't you do anything? But Pauline is someone when you work for, she drums it into you right from the start that she has a lot of power and connections and she can end your career.
In statements to the ministry, the former staff detailed problems, not just with their own treatment, but the children's.
Pauline's attitude is to bully, humiliate, belittle, emotionally abuse, play favourites amongst staff and encouraging disharmony by doing so, lying to parents and being misleading, threatening children to be put in the sleep room if their behaviour wasn't satisfactory to her. Being out of ratio was very common, placing stress on the teaching team.
In other complaints, the parents detailed more than 14 incidents where her children were abused and she'd witnessed teachers being bullied.
Pauline smacked my child when they were approximately 2 years old for no reason. I was witness to this with my own eyes, but she did not see that I saw her do this. I never said or did anything about this, but I did report it to a teacher. I also watched Pauline drag a child by their arm immediately after the parent had left. The child had chippies in their mouth in the morning, which Pauline didn't agree with, so I watched her scrape the chippies out of the child's mouth with her fingers while the child was crying.
The same mother says her children would report back about the abuse.
My child would often come home and tell us that Pauline had smacked certain children that day. They often came home from the centre incredibly hungry because the food they received was dismal, especially when we paid for food as part of their enrolment.
Another mother says her child told her they would be smacked if they didn't sleep. She says many parents and teachers have more complaints but are afraid to speak up because of what she might do. One has told RNZ they were too afraid to confront her. Pauline Murphy has not responded to RNZ's repeated requests for comment. The Ministry of Education says after the serious complaints, it completed an on-site assessment on the 17th of November.
At that time, we identified that staff hadn't been safety checked as required by the Children's Act 2014, and so we immediately suspended its licence. The service provider has subsequently given us evidence that staff have been safety checked. While this met the conditions of the first licence suspension, our investigation is ongoing.
It says a second suspension was then put in place and later lifted when it was able to determine it was safe for children to return. After a 3-week closure, the centre was reopened and will be visited by the Ministry in January. Its investigation is continuing and the Teaching Council and police are also involved. For Checkpoint, Charlotte Cook.
2 new COVID vaccines have been added to the list New Zealanders could get if they pass all their trials and tests. The government's made deals with the British company AstraZeneca and the US firm Novavax to buy enough jabs to cover 9 million people. Added to the existing Pfizer and Janssen deals, 15 million people could be covered. And it revealed some scenarios about how the vaccine might be rolled out, perhaps from April next year. Health correspondent Rowan Quinn reports.
4 government ministers descended on Auckland University for the announcement today, checking out some of the COVID work being done there. The 4 vaccines now in the country's kitty are all from the Northern Hemisphere. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says they're keeping their options open.
We've secured vaccines across 3 different technology platforms to ensure we have diversity across the types of vaccines available. We've secured sufficient vaccines to cover the realm of New Zealand, Tokelau, Niue, the Cook Islands, and our Polynesian neighbours, Samoa, Tonga and Tuvalu, should their governments wish to take these up.
The AstraZeneca vaccine uses new RNA technology similar to the kind being used by Pfizer. It's had mixed results in trials, including accidentally underdosing people and finding that was actually more effective. The US firm Novavax has funding from its government's Operation Warp Speed and is making a vaccine based on COVID's spike protein. Jacinda Ardern says there's no guarantee they'll work.
If some of the vaccines do not prove to be successful, we have an insurance policy by buying across different types of vaccine technology.
All the options will also have to get MedSafe approval. That process has already begun for Pfizer. It's likely to be at least the second quarter of 2021 before any vaccinating begins, with border workers and the most at-risk health workers first in line. COVID-19 Response Minister Chris Hipkins says the logistical work is well underway.
We have all of the consumables that we think will be needed, including additional PPE, syringes,
syringes and so on on order. Some of them have already arrived in the country, and they'll be arriving in the country progressively over the next few months.
The giant super cold freezers needed for the Pfizer vaccine have been caught up by Auckland's port problems. Their entry into the country delayed until the new year. The government's also revealed some of its plans for distribution, although with no firm dates. If there's community transmission, close contacts of people with the virus would go to the front of the queue. But it could be the end of 2022 before everyone who wants a jab gets one. The Prime Minister says work's been done to avoid previous problems with the rollout of flu and measles vaccinations.
This will be a very rigorous centralised program. You've already heard we'll have the ability to track where our vaccines are across the country. We'll also have a national health immunisation register. Previously, that hasn't been available in New Zealand either.
Auckland University vaccinologist Helen Patusis-Harris has been critical of rollouts in the past, but likes the look of this plan, and she's excited about the new products. But with all the vaccines, there's a big question that won't be known until they're widely in use.
Stopping the virus, in the lower respiratory tract is great and can stop you getting really sick. But if it doesn't actually stop you carrying the virus in your upper respiratory tract, you could still actually transmit it, and that's kind of the key.
And the Prime Minister says effectiveness against transmission will be one consideration when the government talks about opening the borders again. But any decision is still a long way away. Mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko Rowan Quinn tēnei.
The Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine is being rolled out in the Northern Marianas this weekend, but other Pacific countries still lack the ultra-cold facilities to store it. The vaccine, which has been approved in the UK and the US, must be stored at minus 70 degrees Celsius, adding an extra layer of complication. Sarah Jane Hopgood has more.
The Northern Mariana Islands will start distribution of the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine this Saturday. RNZ Pacific's correspondent Mark Rabago says the initial shipment of over 5,000 doses arrived on Thursday, ready for the first priority groups such as healthcare workers and seniors. He says Marianas leaders have also stepped up to get vaccinated.
Our representative to U.S. Congress, Gregorio Kilili Sablan, already said that he's willing to be injected in public. And even our governor, Ralph De Leon Guerrero, said he and his family will be available to be vaccinated in public just to shore up public confidence.
The Marianas have purchased and received ultra-cold freezers to store the vaccines.
2 weeks back, our government already purchased ultra-cold freezers because the ordinary usual freezers won't do because this COVID-19, I think, has to be stored in negative 100 degrees. So we purchased 10 ultra-cold freezers from Korea.
But other Pacific countries like Tonga don't have ultra-cold storage facilities. According to the Chief Executive of Tonga's Ministry of Health, Dr. Siale Akoloa, this puts the Pfizer vaccine out of reach for the kingdom.
I think it is a fairly high-tech vaccine that requires a very sophisticated way of cooling them. I think it may just be beyond the capacity of Tonga to use that type of vaccine.
However, he's hopeful Tonga will be able to get a hold of other vaccines before they get their first case of coronavirus.
We are hoping for the other vaccines that are just around the corner that may be available soon, that have easier cold chain way of distributing it. We're waiting for that group of vaccines to be available, and that's where we are hoping to get our supply from.
Dr. Akoola says they've submitted an application for the vaccine to the COVAX facility and are waiting for a response. In the meantime, Tonga has been working with the World Health Organization and UNICEF on educating themselves about the vaccine.
It covers the whole spectrum of activities required, ranging from procurement to cold chain to local capacity to technical logistical requirements. So that's on paper, and it's currently being developed to ensure that it fits our context and we are able to deliver to the public when the vaccine is available.
Meanwhile, the New Zealand government has announced it will provide $75 million of aid to ensure its neighbours in the Pacific get access to vaccines for COVID-19. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says the government's priority will be to vaccinate border workers, essential staff and their household contacts.
We've secured sufficient vaccines to cover the realm of New Zealand, Tokelau, Niue, the Cook Islands and our Polynesian neighbours, Samoa, Tonga and Tuvalu, should their governments wish to take these up.
Prime Minister Ardern says they are working with Australia, who are also looking to support vaccination across the wider Pacific. For Checkpoint, Sarah Jane Hopgood.
It's 19 minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Just a week out from Christmas, New South Wales is scrambling to find the source of 5 new COVID cases. As the country watches and waits, authorities are trying to trace the contacts of the cases too. Our World Watch reporter Polina Lau reports.
That Tasman travel bubble may have to wait. After 13 days of no community transmission, another 3 cases of COVID-19 have been recorded on Sydney's northern beaches, bringing the total to 6. One of the cases is a staff member at a retirement village in Avalon, who's now self-isolating at home while the village has been closed to visitors. A number of aged care facilities will be locked down to visitors while authorities try to contain this outbreak. New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian says the state wants to get on top of this.
We're encouraging everybody who lives on the northern beaches with the mildest of symptoms to come forward and get testing. But we do, as we do always in New South Wales, make sure we let the public know as soon as we know, so that people can take measures, that people can take the actions they need to take. They'll really want to get on top of this. We don't want this to concern us leading into the last few days before Christmas, and I'm just urging the public to remain as vigilant as ever.
Yesterday, a woman in her 60s and a man in his 70s, who are close contacts of each other, tested positive for the virus, and it was discovered they had visited shops while infected. Simone Sinclair from the Avalon Palm Beach Business Centre says some of those shops won't be able to trade for several days.
They have sort of worrying things to think about because it's about to hit probably the most busiest time locally of the year.
Genomic testing is urgently taking place to see if today's new cases are linked to yesterday's. The cases come after a 7-week period where only a couple of local coronavirus cases were found in the state. A South Sydney van driver who transports international airline staff to Sydney Airport also tested positive for the virus in recent days. Mary Louise McLaws, who's a professor of epidemiology at the University of New South Wales, says testing of anyone working around the border is vital.
Well, everyone arriving in Australia should be tested if they can't be tested before they get on the plane. But on arrival, everybody, that includes all of the crew as well and embassy staff. And of course, at the end of the shift of staff who work in quarantine hotels, they should be tested as well so that when they go home, they have a high degree of certainty that they're going home to their friends and family without inadvertently spreading it.
Meanwhile, in Melbourne, the Victorian Ombudsman, Deborah Glass, has found the state government breached human rights when it locked down 9 public housing towers after a virus outbreak in early July. The report says health officials had agreed to a need for a lockdown and expected it to begin the next day, giving people time to plan food supplies and other logistics. But the Premier Daniel Andrews announced it would start that day at 4 p.m. Ms Glass says the rushed lockdown wasn't compatible with the residents' human rights. For Checkpoint, Polina Lau.
South Korea is grappling with an alarming rise in new infections. In the capital, Seoul, there's only one COVID-19 dedicated ICU bed left. But the country has an impressive system to track cases, as CNN's Paula Hancock explains.
The lunchtime rush at a Seoul restaurant with almost every table taken. One diner tests positive for coronavirus. The search begins for who else may have been infected. It starts with a phone call confirming the patient ID from a health official to an epidemiologist investigator. Mobile phone and credit card checks follow. Lee Yong-uk, a contact tracer, and her colleagues physically retrace the footsteps. The restaurant owner shows where the customer was sitting and shares the CCTV footage. Lee checks who is close by and needs to be warned. The owner and staff have already tested negative. Lee makes at least 10 of these visits a day, rarely finishing work before 9 p.m. She tells me the person having lunch with the confirmed case is not wearing a mask and is a close contact. He has been contacted, tested and quarantined for 14 days. With hundreds of new cases every day, this work is becoming harder, with many cases now termed as untraceable. If the mobile phone and credit card usage isn't quite enough to gain a full picture, then contact tracers can track an individual's movements here at this CCTV centre. They can find out exactly where a confirmed case went, who they met, and crucially, they say whether they were wearing a mask. More than 3,000 cameras cover just this one sole district of Socho, normally used for crime prevention, but now a key element in the fight against the coronavirus. The mayor of Socho says the reason this third wave is so difficult to contain is because infections are happening in all cities and districts simultaneously. While the first two waves centred around one or two main outbreaks, health officials now say you can catch the virus at any time in any place. Extra testing sites have been set up around Greater Seoul for the next 3 weeks, health officials providing free tests for all, regardless of symptoms or exposure. Shipping containers are being used to set up more hospital beds to cope with the feared upcoming lack of rooms for coronavirus patients. And more than 1,300 military personnel have been deployed to health centres in Greater Seoul to help with the legwork and data processing. President Moon Jae-in says this is an emergency situation, calling it the final challenge before the vaccines arrive.
CNN's Paula Hancock's there. As holiday house prices skyrocket, there are fears locals will be priced out of the market. That's the view of an economist, as data from the Real Estate Institute of New Zealand shows the median price in many beachside towns is soaring. Year-on-year sale prices in Waihi Beach and Akaroa rose 50%, and sale volumes have also climbed. Jordan Bond reports.
It's normally the major centres that are the talk of a hot housing market. But in the 3 months to November, the median sales price in the Bay of Plenty town of Waihi Beach was up 50% compared to a year ago, to more than $1 million. That's up from $700,000 at the same time last year, with more houses sold too. Long-time Waihi Beach resident Ross Gowdy, the chair of the community board, knows why.
Auckland, as I am told, outside the district, it's not been generated in the place itself. It's not been generated here. And they've actually got money in their pocket.
He says high living costs in major centres are sending some people packing, cashed up and seeking a slice of what he considers paradise.
I hope they stay. I hope they come here to live, not just to come here and then disappear and only be down here for 3 weeks of the year.
In fact, it may be families. He says the local school had 29 new enrolments in the last term and about the same for the start of next year. But the money coming in is making it more difficult for locals who rent, especially young people who make the place run, teachers, cafe staff and other essential vocations.
You've got to be reasonably well off to afford a place in Waihi Beach now. If the professional people say that power the town of doing the things that have got to be done and owning the businesses, they can't afford to rent here. They can barely afford to live here unless they've been here a long time.
Independent economist Benji Patterson says with money on sale, places with low housing supply are likely to see prices further detached from reality and further out of reach for non-owners. And there can be perverse social outcomes as a result.
It's broader than just a political risk. It's an economic one, so it goes back to productivity, but it's also a social risk. And it's something that is not just a risk that we have here and now, it's something that will prove to be ultimately intergenerational unless we solve it.
With young people struggling to get a foothold in these towns, it could cause real issues down the line.
So, for example, in the Coromandel, there's a situation where wages and job opportunities are actually very, very limited. So those that live there, that work in hospitality, that work in the retail environment in those places to service these people with holiday homes, they actually find it very difficult to afford to not just buy, but even to rent in their local areas.
According to a spokesperson for the Real Estate Institute, Dee Crooks, 10,000 homes were sold last month, the biggest November in 14 years.
There's a lot of activity, people wanting to buy and get onto the market. There's this fear of missing out at the moment. So we're seeing a lot of first-time buyers who are now concerned that if these LVRs come back into effect and they may impact them in March, we don't know what the Reserve Bank's going to do, but there's a lot of people wanting to move quickly.
She says usually this is a quiet time of the year for the housing market. Not so in a year of the unexpected. For Checkpoint, Jordan Bond.
And some feedback from you on mental health services. This listener says, who in New Zealand can afford private psychologists? Let's get real, almost no one. The waiting list for any care is so long that it's not in any way fit for purpose. That relates to our interview with Waitemata DHB and a report following the deaths of 4 people under that service's care, all by suspected suicide. And just a reminder, Derek Wright, the head of mental health services, wrongly stated that one of the outpatients was under the care of a private psychologist. They are saying that that was wrong. The man was waiting for a public psychologist. He was on the waiting list, and they are apologising for the mistake that they made in that interview. On the subject of Auckland Ports, this person says the CEO of Auckland Ports must go. What a pathetic litany of excuses. What a joke, they say. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back tomorrow.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. The Minister of Finance says the Ihumātao deal asks the signatories to move promptly to decide the long-term use of the land. The family of patients at Mental Health Unit Hepuna Waiora says the Waitemata DHB neglected and humiliated their loved ones. Firefighters have contained a fire that burned 80 hectares of Tussock near Waipouri Falls, south of Dunedin. A public health alert has been issued for people in Sydney's northern beach suburbs due to a fresh coronavirus outbreak. Fish and Game CEO Martin Taylor has resigned. Earlier this year, he was asked to stop making negative comments about farmers. Our next news and weather is at 7.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
What I've done is release the cause of the Hillsborough fire today, which was fireworks misuse, which has prompted the Section 52 ban.
Live with local, national and international stories as they happen.
Already evacuation centres have opened across the country. There are hundreds there. Authorities have been urging people to, secure their homes.
Up to date if you're up late. Lately with Karen Hay every weeknight from 10 on RNZ National.
Thanks, Karen, and I'm Brian Crump, getting ready for another night on RNZ National. And actually we'll be speaking to Jamie Tahana just before Dateline Pacific with the latest on Cyclone Yasi, which is still a Category 5 and due